In 1996, beneath a coastal facility on Hawaii, my ranger team reached a corridor that wasn't on any map. A faded red stripe cut across the concrete like a boundary marker. The moment my boot touched it, the rubber didn't scuff. It sagged, as if the sole had turned warm and soft. Strings of black tread peeled away and stuck to the paint. My buddy grabbed my shoulder, but the damage kept spreading up the edge of the boot, silent and fast. Our radios hissed once, then went dead. At the far end, a sealed hatch sat under emergency lights, perfectly still. Then my headset clicked with a voice that wasn't on our net. Step back, do not cross again. 20 minutes later, we were in Decon showers, stripped, bagged, and told nothing. By morning, the entry log was gone, and the boots we wore were sealed as evidence, untouched, untested.
This channel documents frontline accounts like this one. Subscribe for future reports.
We were on Hawaii for a joint readiness rotation, routine on paper. Our unit was tasked with a simple underground survey after a maintenance crew reported material failures in a sealed service wing beneath the facility. The brief was sterile: verify structural integrity, document hazards, and mark any off-limits zones for engineers. No mention of anomalies, no mention of previous teams. Just a map that ended at a locked access door and a checklist that assumed normal ventilation, normal lighting, normal comms. We entered as a 4-man element with standard kit, flashlights, radios, tape, chalk, and a handheld meter issued by base safety. The air in the tunnel was humid, warm, and faintly metallic. Condensation ran in thin lines along the walls. Our guide, an E6 from maintenance, stopped at the first hatch, handed over the key, and refused to step through. He only said, "If you see the red stripe, don't argue with it." We staged at the access point just after 200. The maintenance E6 stayed in the lit section, one boot behind the threshold like it was a rule he'd learned the hard way. He watched me check the hinges and the lock cylinder, watched me record the hatch serial, then looked away when I raised my radio for a comms check. "Comms are fine until they're not," he said. "If you lose them, you turn around." Inside, the corridor felt newer than it should have. Clean concrete, no exposed rebar, no standing water. Yet everything was damp. The humidity clung to our sleeves and optics. The air had a warm, metallic smell like wet batteries. Our handheld meter read normal oxygen, normal CO2, nothing that justified the caution in the man's face. We moved as a 4-man element. I took point, my assistant gunner behind me, then our comms man, then rear security. We weren't there for heroics. The checklist was simple. Confirm the reported hazard, tag it, leave it for engineers. I marked our start point on the map and called the distance as we walked. Every 10 meters, I chalked a small X low on the right wall to confirm our return path. It was routine muscle memory. At the first junction, the map said the corridor should dead end. It didn't. A side passage continued left, clean and square, with a faint draft. I paused and ran the rangefinder down it. The beam returned, but the numbers were off. Too long for the dimensions we'd been given. Our comms man leaned in and pointed at the ceiling. A conduit run vanished into the concrete as if someone had poured around it after the fact. We logged it anyway. We logged everything because that's what you do when you don't understand what you're seeing. I keyed the radio to update our control point. The first transmission went through. The second came back, delayed, like an echo of my own voice. Then the net cleared and it was normal again. No one on the other end acknowledged the echo, which meant either they didn't hear it or they weren't going to talk about it. 50 meters deeper, we found the first clue that we weren't the first team down there. On the floor near the base of the wall was a strip of gray tape, old, curling at the edges, like evidence marking. Next to it, a boot print in dried residue that didn't match our tread. It looked smeared, not dragged, as if the sole had softened while the person walked. The print ended abruptly at a point where the concrete was clean again, like someone had wiped the floor. I told the team to stop. We took photos. We measured. We tried to lift a sample with a gloved fingertip. The residue stuck to nitrile as if it was adhesive. When I peeled the glove back, the material clung to the rubber and left behind a dull patch on the fingertip, as if it had been lightly sanded. Not a burn, not a cut, just altered. That was the first time I thought, this isn't a simple maintenance problem. We continued, slower, with more spacing, flashlights low to avoid glare. The corridor lighting was inconsistent, Dim emergency fluorescence in one section, total reliance on our beams in the next. In the darker stretch, the air felt heavier, not in a way a meter could capture, but in the way your body reacts when it expects something to happen. Even our footsteps sounded wrong, like the sound was being swallowed before it bounced back. Then we saw the stripe. It wasn't bright. It wasn't fresh. It was a worn, matte red line painted cleanly across the corridor floor, spanning wall to wall. There were scuffs and chips on it, and at the edges faint black smears, like someone had tried to step across and then thought better of it. The line had no stenciled warning, no placard, no SOP reference. Just paint. I held a fist and the team stacked behind me. Our comms man raised the handheld meter and swept it over the stripe. The display didn't spike. It stayed stubbornly normal. I tested with the rangefinder pointed at the floor beyond the line. It returned. I tossed a small metal washer from my pocket across the stripe. It landed and skittered, perfectly fine. I slid a length of survey tape across. No reaction, no smoke, no sound, nothing dramatic. That's what made it worse. If it had been obvious, we would have left immediately. Instead, it looked like a line someone drew to scare people away. I knelt and touched the red paint with a gloved finger. The surface was dry and dusty. The glove didn't melt. No heat transfer. No chemical stink. I pulled back and examined my fingertip. It looked normal. "Mark it," I said, because that's what the brief demanded. Document, tag, move on. I took a piece of chalk and drew a small arrow on the wall. Red line hazard. As I finished the last letter, the chalk snapped in my fingers. Not from pressure, just brittle, like it had aged a year in a second. I stared at the broken stub. My assistant gunner took it from me and tried to snap another piece from his pouch. Same result. The chalk fractured cleanly. Too easy. Rear security shifted his boot unconsciously, and the toe of his sole grazed the very edge of the stripe. The rubber didn't squeak. It didn't scuff. It sagged. It was subtle at first, a compression that didn't rebound. Then the tread pattern softened like wax. A thin curl of black material peeled up and clung to the red paint. He lifted his foot fast, instinctively, and a string of rubber stretched before it snapped and fell to the floor. "No one crosses," I said, sharp enough that it cut through the tunnel. Our comms man tried to call it in. He keyed the mic once. Static. He keyed again. A brief hiss and a single click like a line being cut. Then silence. Dead carrier. Dead net. And in that silence, with our lights fixed on the stripe and the boot that was now visibly deformed at the toe, we heard something else. A faint, rhythmic sound deeper down the corridor beyond the line, like a slow pressurization cycle or a seal breathing. It wasn't loud. It was steady. It made the hair on my neck lift, because it sounded operational, deliberate, and close. Ahead, past the red boundary, the sealed hatch sat under dim emergency light, waiting like it had been expecting us. I held the team behind the stripe and kept my light fixed on the boot toe that had touched it. The tread pattern was still there, but it looked softened, rounded at the edges like it had been pressed into warm clay. A thin ribbon of rubber lay stuck to the paint. No smoke, no heat shimmer. Just a quiet failure that shouldn't have been possible in room temperature air. "Nobody moves forward," I said. "Tape the line, photograph the boot. We're done." Our comms man tried the radio again. Nothing. He switched to the handheld backup. Dead. He pulled the earpiece out and checked the connector like it was a loose cable. It wasn't. The gear had simply gone inert the moment the rubber touched the stripe. I crouched and slid a metal tent stake forward on the floor until its tip crossed the red paint. No reaction. I pushed it farther past the line toward the hatch. Still nothing. Then I used the stake to drag a loop of survey tape over the stripe, keeping my hands well back. The tape skated across the paint and lay on the far side like a harmless prop. "Not metal," my assistant gunner said. He was watching the boot, not the tape. The boot toe was changing even off the line. Slowly, like the effect had latched on. The rubber looked damp now. Not wet from water, but glossy in a way rubber shouldn't be under our lights. Another small curl lifted and peeled free on its own, dropping onto the red paint. Rear security swore under his breath and tried to scrape the sole with the edge of his knife. The blade bit, but the knife handle, rubberized, left a dark smear on his glove as if it had softened too. He froze and held the knife up for me to see. The grip looked subtly deformed where his fingers had squeezed it. That was the moment I understood the line wasn't a warning about the floor. It was a boundary for something that targeted polymers. Anything flexible, anything made to seal. From beyond the stripe came that steady sound again. A slow, measured cycle, like pressure equalizing through a valve. The sealed hatch at the end of the corridor didn't move, but the sound felt closer, as if the corridor itself carried it. My flashlight beam caught a thin haze hanging low over the far side, barely visible like warmer air against colder concrete. Then my headset clicked. One clean, deliberate tone, despite the radio being dead. A voice came through, flat and controlled, using my call sign correctly. "Step back," it said. "Do not cross again." It wasn't on any frequency we had. There was no carrier hiss, no net traffic, just a direct injection into my ear like someone had plugged into my gear from the other side of the wall. I raised my hand and the team backed up without argument. The moment we cleared 5 meters from the stripe, the pressure cycle sound stopped. The haze on the far side thinned until it was nothing. Behind us, the fluorescence brightened by a fraction, like the tunnel was returning to normal. We didn't run. We didn't talk. We walked out on discipline, carrying a boot that was no longer structurally sound, and equipment that had gone silent at a painted line that should not have mattered. They met us at the access hatch with a response that didn't match a maintenance hazard. 2 MPs and a medic in respirators, plus a lieutenant I'd never seen on the roster. No questions about what we saw, no request for a walkthrough, just hand signals and a hard directive: gear down, weapons safe, follow the taped route. We were marched into a makeshift Decon lane set up inside a service bay. Plastic sheeting, drainage mats, bright gray lights kept deliberately dim. They photographed our boots before we removed them. The toe of rear security's boot had lost its shape. The tread looked rounded, softened, like it had been left too close to heat, but there was no burn pattern. A tech used tongs to lift it, like it was contaminated, and dropped it into a thick evidence bag with a blank label. No unit stamp, no chain of custody number we could see. They took our gloves next, then our radio headsets, then anything with rubber grips, knife handles, cable jackets, even the elastic on a tourniquet. Everything went into bags. We were stripped, scrubbed, rinsed, and scanned. Vitals recorded. Blood drawn. No one explained what they were testing for. Afterward, we sat in folding chairs in damp uniforms while the lieutenant read a short statement off a clipboard. What we'd encountered was an unverified material degradation hazard. We were to speak only to a designated investigator. No informal recounting. No notes. No personal recordings. He didn't threaten us. He didn't need to. The whole process said the same thing. When we finally returned to the talk, our entry wasn't on the board. The sign-out sheet showed 4 empty lines where our names should have been. The maintenance E6 who'd handed us the key was gone, and the access hatch was listed as secured pending structural review. By noon, a new pair of boots had appeared on our cots. Standard issue, no explanation. The old ones, along with the red stripe on the floor, were treated like they'd never existed. And for the rest of that rotation, every time we passed a sealed door underground, someone would glance at the floor first. 2 weeks after we left Hawaii, I requested the incident file through channels. The response was a single page. No record located. Our radios were returned with fresh serial stickers, as if they'd never been issued. The boot that failed at the stripe was listed as damaged in transit, disposed without documentation. Months later, a buddy from base safety called once and asked a question he shouldn't have known to ask. Was the line painted, or was it there already? Before I could answer, the call dropped. I never heard from him again.